my name is Anna Barker, and I'm the curator of the University of Iowa Main Library exhibition dedicated to Dostoevsky's 200th birthday. I welcome our online community to this virtual tour, and I'm going to reverse my camera and take you on this tour and introduce you to the highlights of what we put together this fall at the University of Iowa. So here's our Dostoevsky and, oops, sorry. There we go. So I'm going to actually walk outside the exhibition and show you the front of the main vitrine. So as you can see, it's a library, lots of students studying here. It's the last week of the fall semester. And the exhibition front case looks like this. It is an invitation to Russian Tea Party. The title of the exhibition is From Revolutionary Outcast to a Man of God. And you see these lovely birch trees in the background. They actually have very remarkable literary pedigree. These birch trees were used at the University of Iowa production of Chekhov's Three Sisters, which happened a year and a half ago. And they had an actual birch forest on the stage. And I remember those birch trees when I was putting together this exhibition. We contacted the University of Iowa theater department, and they loaned us a few of their birches. So, and of course, Chekhov was hugely influenced by Dostoevsky. He was 20 when Dostoevsky died. So we have these Chekhov birches at a Dostoevsky exhibition. And then we have lovely Russian porcelain. It's from the St. Petersburg Porcelain Company. And we have some pancakes on a plate. The pancakes are, of course, plastic. The birches are paper. And the fall, autumn leaves, maple leaves are made of silk. This is a library, and we had to absolutely observe all the rules because some of the archival material that we have on display is very special. And of course, the samovar, because what Russian Tea Party could survive without a samovar. And at this point, I'm going to walk through the other entrance to the exhibition and start the tour. So why an invitation to a tea party, and why an invitation to a pancake party? On this wall, and I'm not going to come too close because I don't want to give any spoilers. This is the last page of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and there's a pancake party on that last page. So the entire exhibition is designed as an invitation to experience Russian culture and to talk about the Russian tradition of tea parties. On this wall opposite to the last page of Brothers Karamazov, I have a display of information about the things that are on display in the main case. And most importantly, I have this wonderful painting by Kustodiev, Merchant's Wife having tea. And you have all the attributes of a Russian tea party: a samovar, some jam in a lovely little vase, little bits of fruit, and various crackers, and of course a kitty. You can see a church in the background. So why are Russian tea parties and Russian tradition of drinking tea so important? Russia is a very cold country, and tea makes you very, very warm. So what is the purpose of this samovar? Samovar in Russian means actually to cook by itself. And it is a very large brass container that contains hot water and nothing else. This particular samovar came from Tula. It's the city where samovars were manufactured. So the Russian expression to carry coal to Newcastle turns into to travel to Tula with your own samovar, because that is the region where they manufactured samovars. It is a very fancy container for keeping water hot. And this particular samovar was manufactured in the 19th century. It contains a metal tube in the middle, and you would put hot coals into that tube. And you can see there are little holes at the bottom of the samovar and at the very top to make sure that those coals stay hot. And where then do you have the tea? Well, the tea is in the little porcelain pot. And the little porcelain pot contains what Russians call zavarka, or tea concentrate. If you drink nothing but the tea concentrate, you probably don't sleep for 3 days. So the hostess of the tea event would sit at the head of the table, and she would know all of your tea drinking preferences. So if you want weak tea, she will add just a tiny bit of Zavarka into your cup and add lots of hot water. If you want stronger tea, the hostess will pour more of the Zavarka, of the tea concentrate, into your cup and add less hot water. And this way you can sit at the table for a couple of hours and everyone is happy and content, drinking 5, 6, 7 cups of tea, staying very warm. And the conversation just keeps going. So that is the significance of the Russian samovar. And then pancakes are sort of the ubiquitous Russian food. You can make them out of wheat or you can make them out of buckwheat. They can be sweet, they can be savory, you can eat them with jam, you can eat them with caviar, you can eat them with ham and cheese. They can be consumed for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. They make just an absolutely delightful meal. Those of you who are reading Brothers Karamazov with me on 100 Days of Brothers Karamazov, you probably noticed that characters often invite other characters to tea. Even someone like Smerdyakov has a large samovar going when Ivan comes to visit him. And then the Russian shawls. All the shawls on display here are manufactured in sort of the place for shawl manufacturing in Russia today. It's the city of Pavlova Posad. And those of you, once again, who are reading Brothers Karamazov with me probably noticed that Grushenka is our character who is sporting very fancy Russian shawls. So Grusha is wearing a very, very lovely black shawl when she is waiting for the former and indisputable one to come and pick her up at her place. And notice that the shawls that I have on display here are printed. Of course, printed shawls are not quite as stunning as woven shawls, and Grushenka's shawl is probably woven because she wanted to have that ostentation display of wealth to prove to her former and indisputable one that she's not a scrawny teenager anymore, and she's kind of the kind of woman who has money and who has created her own wealth. And then last but not least, birches are not just this wonderful cultural phenomenon in Russia, but birch trees are very important for Russian culture in many, many ways. There are a lot of folk traditions that are concentrating on birches. I have on display here this amazing painting by Isaac Levitan, who was a very good friend of Chekhov, actually, of this lovely birch grove. Birch is also used for furniture manufacturing. Birch bark is so soft that you can make baskets out of it. And also, as a child who grew up in the Soviet Union, I had lots and lots of birch juice, which is extracted the same way as maple syrup. So you tap a birch tree, and the birch juice is very sweet. It has very pleasant, gentle flavor. It's clear, yellowish liquid that is quite sweet. And so birches are ubiquitous in Russia. And so if you have references of Russians sort of hugging birches and weeping, it is Russia's national tree. So welcome to Russian culture. And I'm just going to show you the extent of the exhibition. So I was standing at the front vitrine, and now you can see all of the various cases, all dedicated to Dostoevsky. And I'm going to continue the tour by focusing on this display, which highlights all the people that were important in Dostoevsky's life, or books that were written by people who knew him, or books written by Dostoevsky himself. Dostoevsky conducted very extensive correspondence with many people throughout his life. So in this case, we have Dostoevsky's letters and also collected letters. And also we have his writer's diary, which is a publication that he supervised in the final years of his life, and where he included a lot of the works that were shorter, novellas, short stories, also translations of publications from that he saw in European journals and newspapers, and also his essays. So great source of information about Dostoevsky, his letters and his diaries. And then Dostoevsky had a very close relationship with his older brother, whose name is Mikhail. And Mikhail was just a few, less than a year, I think, older than Dostoevsky. And they were best friends in childhood. And his correspondence with Mikhail is a great source of information about his early years And I'm going to talk about Mikhail a little more when we will be discussing the years after Dostoevsky's return from Siberia. Andrei was his younger brother, and Andrei left a memoir of his older brother, Fyodor. So we have Andrei's memoir in this display case as well. And then we focus also on Dostoevsky's daughter from his second marriage. And she was very young when Dostoevsky passed away. So her reminiscences of her father are very much, though, influenced by her mother's recollections of the father. And here is a photograph of Anna Grigorievna Dostoevskaya with the two children that Dostoevsky had with her. He didn't have any children of his own with his first wife. And we'll talk about his first wife and his second wife, Anna Grigorievna, in a moment. And then, of course, we have the reminiscences of Anna Grigorievna Dostoevskaya. Here's her photograph that was taken in the 20th century. She died in 1918. And I mentioned her a couple of times in my comments for 100 Days of Brothers Karamazov. I absolutely love this quote, and I'm just going to read it to you. It's displayed right here. All of my life, it seemed to me some kind of an enigma that my good husband not only loved and respected me as other husbands love and respect their wives, but almost bowed down before me as if I were some sort of special being, specially created just for him. And this was true not just of the first moments of marriage, but for all the remaining years until his death. But the reality is that I am not distinguished by beauty. I possess neither talents nor unusual intellectual development, and my education was only to the gymnasium level or gymnasium level. And in spite of this, I was worthy of the deep adoration and almost worship of such a wise and talented man. Anna Grigorievna was quite young. She was 34 years old when Dostoevsky passed away. She never remarried. And when she was asked, why does she marry someone else? Her response was quite delightful. Whom could I marry after Dostoevsky? Perhaps only Tolstoy. And of course, Tolstoy was at this point very unhappily married to Sonia. So this display is highlighting both the writing of Dostoevsky, such as his letters and his diaries, and the writing by people who knew him personally, his brothers, his daughter, and his wife. And then we move on in the exhibition to the poster that you all saw on 100 Days of Brothers Karamazov. I posted it. This amazing portrait of Dostoevsky is by Fritz Eichenberg, and I'm going to talk about his illustrations in a moment. And this introduction to the exhibition talks about the 4 sections of the exhibition that we created: rebel, convict, gambler, and prophet. And we begin in the rebel section, and here you can see the first portrait that we have of Dostoevsky. It was created when Dostoevsky was 26 years old in 1847, just before his arrest and exile to Siberia. It was by Konstantin Trutovsky. It's housed at the State Literature Museum in Moscow. And as with all writers, we have to start at the very beginning. And we start at the very beginning with an introduction to Dostoevsky's family. His father, who served with the Russian army as a doctor in 1812. Just like Tolstoy had relatives who participated in the War of 1812, Dostoevsky's father was a doctor during that time period. And after the war, he got a commission to be a doctor at the Mariinsky Hospital in Moscow. So even though Dostoevsky is associated with St. Petersburg, because most of his novels are set in St. Petersburg. Let me just list the ones that are on display here: Poor Folk, The Double, White Nights, Humiliated and Insulted, Notes from the Underground, Crime and Punishment, Idiot, and The Adolescent. So these are the novels that we have on display here that are set in St. Petersburg. Dostoevsky was born in Moscow. Not only that, he was born in a hospital, which is quite unusual during that time period. The other great Russian writers of the 19th century, such as Pushkin, Lermontov, Tolstoy, Turgenev, were born on the ancestral estates. So Dostoevsky is really the harbinger of modernity in Russia. He was a child who was born in a big city, and not only that, he was born in a hospital. His mother, who was from the merchant class, died when Dostoevsky was 16 years old. And at that point, he and his brother Mikhail sent to St. Petersburg, and Dostoevsky enrolls in the St. Petersburg Military Engineering School, which is housed in this building that you see right below the Moscow hospital where he was born. And this building is called the Mikhailovsky Castle, not to be confused with the Mikhailovsky Palace. And it truly is a castle. To this day, it has a moat and a drawbridge. It was constructed by the Russian Emperor Paul I because he did not want to live in any of the palaces associated with his mother, Catherine the Great, because his mother was involved in the death of his father, who was the grandson of Peter the Great. And so Paul did not want to live in the Winter Palace or in Catherine's palace. He constructed the Mikhailovsky Castle for himself to be safe from palace intrigue. And guess where he was murdered? Inside the Mikhailovsky Castle. So fate caught up with him there. The Romanovs did not want to hold on to this building, and it became a building of the St. Petersburg University, and it became the military engineering school where Dostoevsky studied. He graduated from the military engineering school and stayed in St. Petersburg. And in this case, the first case of our exhibition, we have two amazing books on display. This book was published in England in early 19th century, and it's a tour guide to Russia. And when we have it open on the page depicting the Kremlin, because it's the most iconic building in Moscow. The second book we have on display here was published in the 1850s in Paris, and it's also a tour guide to Russia. But here we have on display the statue of Peter the Great. And just a couple of days ago, I mentioned the statue of Peter the Great, which has the nickname of Bronze Horseman because it's a reference to a Pushkin poem. And this is the most iconic image of St. Petersburg. So two wonderful books on display, one honoring Dostoevsky's Moscow origins, and the second one dedicated to Dostoevsky's prolific life as a writer who immortalized St. Petersburg in his works. The second case is dedicated to Dostoevsky's first publication, which is Poor Folk, or in Russian it's called Бедные люди. It's fascinating. Dostoevsky's first publication was actually a translation. So I mentioned to you that over the break, I plowed through three novels by Honoré de Balzac, and one of them was Eugénie Grandet. And the first portrait of a writer who influenced Dostoevsky that I have on display here is Honoré de Balzac, because Dostoevsky translated Eugénie Grandet and published it. And the publication was such a terrific flop. Dostoevsky was 22 years old, that it steered him towards original composition, and thank goodness. So the first publication was a translation that didn't work. The second publication was Poor Folk, and it was a huge success. It was remarkable to what extent literary critics actually picked up on Dostoevsky's talent to write truthfully about the life of the urban poor. And it's fascinating that some of the writers that influenced Dostoevsky in his creation of Poor Folk were Pushkin, and you see his portrait right underneath the portrait of Honoré de Balzac. Particularly Pushkin's Belkin Tales, the two characters of Poor Folk, and you have illustrations of the characters Makar Devushkin and Varvara Dobroselova. They actually correspond in the novel. It's an epistolary novel, and in their letters they discuss, guess what, the works of Pushkin. So Pushkin will become extremely important for Dostoevsky all through his literary career. And then the author that we have right under Pushkin is Nikolai Gogol. And you probably remember just how much time I spent discussing the works of Nikolai Gogol, who created that all-important quote, the image of Russia as a galloping troika. In Poor Folk, Dostoevsky is very influenced by Gogol's short story, The Overcoat. Then the last portrait that I have on display here is of Nikolai Karamzin, who was a Russian writer and a historian. His history of the multi-volume history of the Russian state was read by everyone in Russia who was interested in the history of Russia. But also he wrote a wonderful, very sentimental novella called Poor Lisa, Bедная Lisa. And of course, the title, that Karamzin title, influenced Dostoevsky's title of Poor Folk. So this book is quite short. It's an epistolary novel between two characters, Makar and Varvara. It was hailed as an incredibly daring and important first publication for the young Dostoevsky. Critics like Alexander Herzen and Nekrasov were very impressed with Dostoevsky's ability to create a very truthful and passionate image of the life of the urban poor. And so Dostoevsky felt that his career was launched. He was very pleased with himself to the point where he resigned his military engineering post. And it was a very premature decision because his second publication, The Double, did not do so well with the critics. Right here, the first portrait that I have on display is of E.T.A. Hoffman. Those of you who are wondering if you have ever had any contact with the works of E.T.A. Hoffman, who was a late 18th, early 19th century German writer, his Nutcracker was turned by Tchaikovsky into a ballet. So that is the most famous composition of E.T.A. Hoffman. But his Devil's Elixir was a book that influenced Dostoevsky in the creation of his Double. And the Double was not received very well by critics, which is quite surprising because the Double reverberates in pretty much every composition of Dostoevsky that he has written since the second important work. But also it influenced several writers in the 19th and 20th centuries. And here we have on display the portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson, who was very impressed with Dostoevsky's Double and Crime and Punishment, and a special collections edition of his Jekyll and Hyde, which of course is about the doubling of human personalities. And we have on display also the portrait of Oscar Wilde and a special collections illustrated edition of the picture of Dorian Gray, which also deals with the doubling of human personalities. And Oscar Wilde was impressed by Dostoevsky's Double and also his novel, The Humiliated and Insulted. And the most exciting photograph we have in this place is, in this display case, is of Sylvia Plath, who wrote her undergraduate honors thesis on Dostoevsky's Double and the doubling in Brothers Karamazov. And this thesis is available online. So those of you who are interested in reading Sylvia Plath's thoughts about Dostoevsky's Double and Brothers Karamazov, I highly recommend it. And one more book on display in this case is a German translation of The Double, which is entitled The Doppelganger. So this is definitely a huge contribution to the doppelganger literature. And so from the novel The Double, we move on to his third important publication, which is entitled White Nights. And I spoke about it in my preliminary notes on Dostoevsky in August. White Night refers to this period in St. Petersburg where it doesn't get dark. Pretty much all of June and early July, Russians celebrate this incredible lightness of the northern midsummer. Dostoevsky writes this beautiful novella. It was published in 1848, just before his arrest. And it's a boy meets girl story that is absolutely delightful. It takes your breath away. It's quite short, and I can't recommend it enough. Please consider reading it during the break before we dive into French literature next year. There are many film adaptations of White Nights. And during the Dostoevsky Film Festival that we housed here at in Iowa City, the local film theater, film scene, screened the Luchino Visconti Italian adaptation of White Nights. starring Maria Schell, Jean Marais, and Marcello Mastroianni. And it is an absolute masterpiece. But also here we have on display images from a French adaptation, a Tamil adaptation, and a Hindi adaptation of White Knights. We sort of get a sense that Dostoevsky is writing about this dreamer, this young man who is roaming through St. Petersburg, very lonely and very dejected. And we sort of have a very good sense of where Dostoevsky was as a human being at some point, feeling lonely, feeling dejected, and feeling that his literary career is not headed in the direction where he would like it to be. During this time period, Dostoevsky joins a reading group called the Petrashevsky Circle. And in the Petrashevsky Circle, they read works by French and English utopian socialists such as Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. They meet and discuss political topics that would not be a great crime to discuss any other year, but the year happened to be 1848. And I mentioned this in some of my comments on Brothers Karamazov. 1848 was not just a year of a revolution in Europe. It was a year of many revolutions in Europe. Paris, of course, had their own revolution. It was the third one. The first one was 1789. The second one was 1830. And now the third great French Revolution was happening in 1848. Warsaw had an uprising against Russian rule. Budapest had an uprising about Austrian Habsburg rule. Austria saw unrest during this time period too. And Nicholas I, who was the Tsar of Russia at this time period, did not want to see a revolution in Russia. He was very cautious about all kinds of revolutionary activity in Russia because when he became Tsar in December of 1825, there was an uprising against his rule. His brother Alexander I, and of course he's the character, the Russian character of War and Peace, the Russian Tsar who defeats Napoleon, died in 1825. And Nicholas II was his younger brother. Sorry, Nicholas the first was his younger brother, and he came to power in 1825, having to deal with an uprising of some of the officers who wanted to have a lot more liberal reforms in Russia, who wanted to have a constitution in Russia, and who wanted the abolition of serfdom. Nicholas I dealt very harshly with the members of the Decembrist group. Many of them were exiled to Siberia, and the 5 ringleaders were hanged. So Nicholas I, who dealt with the Decembrist uprising in 1825, did not want to have a repeat of the Decembrist uprising in 1848. And he had all of these young men arrested and sent to the Peter and Paul fortress in the spring of 1849. In December of 1849, a sentence was given to these young men, and it was death by the firing squad. They were all marched out, and here is an image of this mock execution that Dostoevsky underwent. Of course, none of these young men knew that the execution is going to be canceled. They came to the Semyonovsky Platz, or the Semyonovsky parade ground, knowing full well that these are the last moments of their lives. And I have this incident of Dostoevsky's life displayed opposite the case where I have his novel, The Idiot, on display. Dostoevsky will describe this experience of knowing that you have only a few more minutes to live in the novel, The Idiot, where the main character, Prince Myshkin, describes this experience at the very beginning of the novel. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment or life of hard labor in Siberia. And Dostoevsky was sent to the city of Omsk, where he joined a penal colony and spent 4 years of his life in this penal colony in Siberia. And here in this case, we have on display a wonderful map of Russia, which is a very unusual map of Russia. Instead of showing the European section of Russia, which is what we are most familiar with in the West, it shows Russia from the Ural Mountains and the Caspian Sea to Kamchatka and the Japanese Sea, and Russia's border with Japan and China. So this is our homage to the years that Dostoevsky will spend in Siberia. First, he will be stationed in a prison camp in Omsk. Then later, he will be moved to the city of Semipalatinsk. And as he was traveling through Russia and crossing the Ural Mountains, first and foremost, he stopped in the city of Tobolsk. And in this Siberian city of Tobolsk, he met and was greeted by 3 wives of the Decembrists who followed their husbands voluntarily into exile in Siberia. And these women were just sort of the guardian angels of the prison camps. If prisoners needed to have letters written, these women would help them. If families wanted to send money or books or letters to their loved ones in Siberia, they send them to the Decembrist wives, and then these women pass them on to the recipients. And also, they gave away New Testaments to all the newly arriving political prisoners and prisoners who were coming to Siberia. Dostoevsky received his copy of the New Testament from these 3 wives of the Decembrists, and he treasured this book for his entire life. The physical description of this New Testament that he received from the Decembrist wives is described in some of his novels, such as Crime and Punishment. And also, this will be the last book from which he's going to read on his deathbed. So the only book that he was allowed to read while in the prison camp was given to him by these Decembrist wives, and he will treasure it all his life. After 4 years of hard labor in this prison camp in Omsk, a lot of people were petitioning for him. And one of the people who petitioned for him was General Eduard Todleben, who was a hero of the Crimean War of 1853-1856. And after all of these pleas for Dostoevsky, Dostoevsky was finally released from his hard labor service in the Omsk prison camp and became a soldier in the city of Semipalatinsk. And very slowly, more and more rights were given back to him, such as the right to read books other than the New Testament. And eventually, he was given a low military officer rank. And of course, he was a commissioned officer after his graduation from the military engineering school. With that came the right to publish and to get married. And when Dostoevsky was stationed in Siberia, he made some money tutoring children of officials who were stationed in Siberia. And through his connections, he met this family, the Isayev family, and fell in love with a woman who was married. Of course, she didn't want to have anything to do with him until the moment when her husband died. So Maria Isayeva was an absolutely fascinating woman. She becomes Dostoevsky's first wife. Of course, she first rejects his marriage proposal, but eventually accepts it because of 2 very important reasons. She has a son from her first marriage, and she has tuberculosis. And tuberculosis in the 19th century was a death sentence. Does she have any other marriage prospects? As a woman who has a child and tuberculosis, probably not. Does Dostoevsky have any other marriage prospects? As someone who will remain under police surveillance for the rest of his life, and Dostoevsky's police surveillance was not lifted till he was 55 years old, just 5 years before his death. He didn't have any marriage prospects either. So these 2 lonely people were thrown into each other's presence, and the marriage was not a happy one for either of them. And I will read to you this quote of Dostoevsky. "Because of her strange, suspicious, and fantastic character, we were definitely not happy together, but we could not stop loving each other. And the more unhappy we were, the more attached to each other we became." This passionate and sad experience of his first marriage definitely influenced many of the relationships that Dostoevsky will describe later on in his novels. So what happened during these Siberia years is Dostoevsky gained an awful lot of experiences, not just as a human being and as a writer. And many of the stories of people who were imprisoned with him will end up on the pages of his novels. Dostoevsky will write a book entitled Notes from the Dead House. It will be published in the Time magazine, or Vremya, in 1860 to 1862. It's an autobiographical novel that is based on his experience as a convict in a hard labor prison colony. I love what the Russian critic Alexander Herzen said about this novel. He compared Dostoevsky to Dante descending into the inferno of the human soul, and the impact on the novel to that of Michelangelo's fresco, The Last Judgment. We have on display here an illustrated copy of the translation, English translation of Notes from the Dead House, and the illustrations are by Fritz Eichenberg. And I'll speak about him in a little while in greater detail. And also we have on display here a set of shackles. You have to understand that all the prisoners in this prison camp were shackled at their ankles at all times. They did not take off the shackles for sleeping or for washing on any occasion. So for the 4 years that Dostoevsky spent in this penal colony, he had shackles around his ankles 24/7. Dostoevsky's Notes from the Dead House is a heart-wrenching book. As I mentioned in my notes for 100 Days of Brothers Karamazov, I reread pretty much all of the important works of Dostoevsky. I reread all of the works that are on display at this exhibition. And the last book that I reread this August was Notes from the Dead House, because it is such a truthful and absolutely debilitating account of the suffering of a human being through unimaginable hellish experiences that helped Dostoevsky grow as a human being. So we are looking at Mitya's fate at this point in Brothers Karamazov, and many of the thoughts that Mitya has at this point in the novel are very much so influenced by Dostoevsky's thoughts during his Siberian imprisonment. And it's fascinating. At one point, Dostoevsky wonders if he will be ever accepted by the fellow prisoners that are stationed in Omsk with him. You see, they did not accept him as a fellow prisoner because, one, he was a political prisoner, and two, he was not of their class. He was a college graduate, he was a commissioned officer, he was a published author, and many of the people who were stationed in this camp were peasants, soldiers who murdered their commanding officers. Many of the people who were stationed in this camp were murderers and admitted to committing these murders. And they did not accept Dostoevsky because for them, he was a member of the ruling class. And so Dostoevsky's alienation was heightened by the fact that he was away from the life that he was accustomed to, the life that he found familiar, and still not accepted by this prison community. And one day, and Dostoevsky will recount this experience in his Diary of a Writer, he woke up and looked at all of these prisoners and recalled an incident in his early childhood where he was in a field, and all of a sudden somebody shouted "wolf," and he froze. He completely froze with terror, and he remembered the moment where this Russian peasant, whose name was Marey, came over to the trembling young Dostoevsky and said to him in a coaxing maternal voice, "There, what's all the fuss all about? It will all be well." And he put his finger on Dostoevsky's trembling lips. And Dostoevsky remembered this moment of maternal kindness that he experienced as a child. And he looked at all of the unfortunates around him. And he said to himself, who am I to judge them? Who knows? Maybe one of these people is that very same peasant Marie who comforted me in my moment of terror. And from that moment comes the rest of Dostoevsky. Everything that you see in this exhibition comes from that moment of Dostoevsky realizing that he cannot be the judge of other human beings because he too is human, and his humanity is flawed, and he cannot be above other human beings. And his regeneration and his fortitude come from that moment. Do you remember when Alyosha Karamazov at one point falls to the ground, a young man, and gets up from the ground, a fighter for life? This transformation of Dostoevsky was not that instantaneous, but it definitely, that moment of Alyosha definitely is an example of that kind of transformation that Dostoevsky experienced during his years in Siberia. Fascinating fact about Notes from the Dead House. The Czech composer Leos Janáček wrote an opera based on this novel. And it's fascinating. Janáček didn't just write the score of the opera. He wrote the libretto as well, but that's not all. He actually, his Russian was so good that he first translated Dostoevsky's Notes from the Dead House into Czech, then based his libretto on his own translation, and then wrote the music based on his own libretto. And here's a photograph of one of the scenes from the Metropolitan Opera production of the opera Notes from the Dead House, or From the House of the Dead, as it's called. And I actually went to see this 2009 production in New York City. It was absolutely stunning. It really left you speechless at the end. And it's fascinating that Janáček is one of only two composers, the second being Sergei Prokofiev, who wrote substantial musical compositions based both on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Janáček, of course, wrote his Kreutzer Sonata String Quartet that is based on Tolstoy's novella, The Kreutzer Sonata. And when we get to Dostoevsky's novel, The Gambler, I will talk about Prokofiev and his opera based on The Gambler. And here's an image of the house where Dostoevsky lived between 1857 and 1859 in Semipalatinsk. So we are moving away from his Siberia years and moving closer to, right here on display, we have the score of Janáček's Zmrtvého domu, or From the House of the Dead. And moving to his post-Siberia publication. So of course, this section of the exhibition is entitled Convict, or in Russian it's Katorжник. Notes from the Dead House was his first important post-Siberia publication. Dostoevsky also becomes a voracious reader at this point to catch up on all of the publications that happened in Europe during this time period. So he reads a lot of Honoré de Balzac, he reads a lot of Charles Dickens, to the point where in his other important post-Siberia publication, a novel entitled Humiliated and Insulted, he is influenced to Charles Dickens to such a huge extent that one of the main characters of the novel, a teenager, shares the name with Charles Dickens's character in Old Curiosity Shop, Nell. So Dickens has a character whose name is Nell in Old Curiosity Shop, and Dostoevsky has a character whose name is Nell, who has an English grandfather in Humiliated and Insulted. During this time period, Dostoevsky also travels to Europe for the first time, and his 2 trips to Europe give him a fascinating perspective on Europe. He writes a book about his travels to Europe, and it's entitled Winter Notes on Summer Impressions. And in it, Dostoevsky is quite critical of Europe, and he feels that Europe is very hypocritical to criticize Russia all the time for their lack of freedom, because some of the things that he saw in Europe, and especially in London, just kind of shocked Dostoevsky about the state of affairs in this world capital. Of course, Dostoevsky could not stay in the nicer parts of town, and the poorer sections of London, Charles Dickens's London, shocked him with the level of poverty and misery that he experienced in this bustling world metropolis. Dostoevsky also encounters a fascinating young woman whose name is Apollinaria Suslova during this time period. And he travels to some of these European locations. And Dostoevsky traveled extensively through Europe. He went to Cologne, Berlin, Dresden, Wiesbaden, Brussels, London, Paris. He also traveled through Switzerland and Italy. And his encounter with Apollinaria Suslova was both joyous, because he experienced the kind of love for the first time that he did not encounter in his life, but also a little stunning. Apollinaria Suslova was a revolutionary, and she was a lot more radical in her revolutionary beliefs than Dostoevsky was when he was in his 20s in the 1840s. In Russia, there's sort of this tradition of discussing what happens in Russian political life in the 1840s, where 1840s liberals talk about more freedoms that they would like to see in Russia, less censorship, abolition of serfdom, possibly an adoption of a Russian constitution. And then the radicalism that follows in the 1860s and the 1870s, where radicalized students do not feel that just discussing the possibility of having a constitution or more liberal public sphere is enough, and they start fighting for all of these concepts by violent means. And so Dostoevsky sees to what extent Russian intellectual and political life has evolved between the time when he was involved in the Petrashevsky circle in the 1840s to this time period where students like Apollinaria Suslova, and here's her portrait, she was absolutely beautiful. Students like Apollinaria Suslova really feel that they must take matters into their own hands, and they must sweep off whatever is in existence in Russia in order to make it into a better place by all means possible, including violent means. Dostoevsky will talk about the radicalization of Russian political life extensively in his later novels, and will dedicate the entire novel Demons to this process. Dostoevsky's life is quite unsettled during this time period. First of all, Dostoevsky's marriage with his first wife, Maria Isayeva, or Maria Dostoevsky at this point, is not going well. And she died in 1864, leaving Dostoevsky the sole guardian of her son. And Dostoevsky will take care of his stepson for the rest of his life. But also another shocking thing happens to Dostoevsky during this time period, and that is the death of his brother Mikhail. And we talked about his brother Mikhail a little bit while we were discussing some of the sources about Dostoevsky. Mikhail also died in 1864, and Dostoevsky is devastated by this loss. After Dostoevsky returns from Siberia, it is his brother Mikhail who starts a couple of publications, Time and Epoch, where he starts publishing his brother's works. And these publications were really a godsend for Dostoevsky because he couldn't find publishers after his return from Siberia. And so his work with Mikhail was very, very important to him. Dostoevsky assumes all responsibility for his stepson, but also he assumes all responsibility for Mikhail's debts that he incurred while publishing Dostoevsky. And he assumes responsibility for Mikhail's wife and children. So all of a sudden we have Dostoevsky in his 40s. He's still struggling to establish himself as a writer. He loses his wife. He's the guardian of a stepson, and he assumes all responsibilities for his brother's family, which of course creates an impossible financial strain in his life. He proposes marriage to Apollinaria Suslova, this young woman with whom he had an affair, and she rejects him. And at this point, we are basically standing at a moment of tremendous conflict in Dostoevsky's life. And it's the kind of darkness that he had to deal with and overcome. And during this time period, he is writing one of the publications that will become the foundation of the 5 important novels, the 5 great novels, the 5 prophetic novels, that is the focus of the second part of this exhibition. And this book is Notes from Underground. His wife is dying while he's writing this book. It's a fascinating book because many of the ideas that he will express in those final 5 novels are already surfacing in this book. You probably recall how often I quoted from Notes from Underground in my comments on Brothers Karamazov. In so many ways, and I have a fun display here for Notes from Underground. I have 3 books on display, and the first 2 are the books that directly influenced Dostoevsky writing Notes from Underground. And they are by Ivan Turgenev, his novel Fathers and Sons, and Nikolai Chernyshevsky and his novel, What's to Be Done. Dostoevsky reads both novels, and his ideas about human freedom start crystallizing in the process of reading these two very, very important early 1860s Russian novels. Let me read to you a quote from Notes from Underground to give you an idea of what Dostoevsky is trying to accomplish in this book. And I have this quote on display here. Now I ask you, what can be expected of man as a being endowed with such strange qualities? Shower him with all earthly blessings, drown him in happiness completely over his head, so that only bubbles pop up on the surface of happiness as on water. Give him such economic satisfaction that he no longer has anything left to do at all, except sleep, eat gingerbread, and worry about the non-cessation of world history. And it is here, just here, that he, this man, out of sheer ingratitude, out of sheer lampoonery, will do something nasty. Dostoevsky is starting to talk about human freedom and human inability to constantly act in our rational self-interest, precisely because we are free to act out our wantings. And I really like how Pevere and Volokhanskaya translate that Russian word in their translation of Notes from the Ground. It's these wantings. Dostoevsky also addresses what happens to human beings when they are overwhelmed by ideas, the kind of ideas that make them believe that the implementation of these ideas is essential for the happiness of humanity, even if they bring about the death of individual human beings. And Dostoevsky talks about the Tower of Babel already here as this moment in human history where humanity reached to the heavens to bring God down to their level. Dostoevsky, of course, saw the Crystal Palace constructed in the 1850s in London. The design was by Joseph Paxton, and this building, stunning building, was constructed for the International Exhibition of 1851. Dostoevsky saw the Crystal Palace, which he criticizes extensively in Notes from Underground, as yet another iteration of the Tower of Babel, of this idea of humanity who all of a sudden feels empowered to discard much of what makes us human in the service of an idea. And so those of you who are reading Brothers Karamazov with me, you are realizing that many, many of the passages that we have in Brothers Karamazov are influenced by this idea. At the same time, Dostoevsky is developing a serious gambler problem. Why? Well, we talked about the fact that he takes on extensive debts that are left over from his brother. And he also feels that he cannot shake this obsession with gambling. I have a great book here on display, The Dostoevsky Effect, and the subtitle is Problem, Gambling, and the Origins of Addiction. And many critics believe that Dostoevsky's gambling problem was a gambling addiction. Dostoevsky, after the publication of Notes from Underground, finally finds a fantastic publisher. And this publisher, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but don't worry, I'll go back. This publisher is a remarkable human being. His name is Mikhail Katkov, and he was the editor of a monthly Russian magazine called The Russian Messenger, where the following books were serialized during his 20-year tenure as the chief editor. Turgenev's On the Eve, Fathers and Sons and Smoke, Tolstoy's Family Happiness, The Cossacks, War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, and Dostoevsky's The Village of Stepanchikov, A Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and Brothers Karamazov. Can you imagine being Mikhail Katkov, this incredible editor who got to publish the greatest works of 19th century Russian literature. Just imagine that all of us are Russian subscribers to the Russian Messenger in 1866. And do you know what comes once a month through our subscription? The next installment of War and Peace and the next installment of Crime and Punishment. We are so lucky as Russian readers to have Katkov as the editor of the Russian Messenger. But of course, in order to publish Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky still needed some money to live on. And so he makes a deal with another publisher, whose name is Stilovsky, for the publication of another novel that was also supposed to be written in 1866. And of course, since Dostoevsky had a gambling addiction, it was very easy for him to write a novel called The Gambler. And so I'm going to focus for a few minutes on the novel The Gambler, because it's such an important novel for Dostoevsky and his personal life. The stipulation of this contract that he signed with Stilovsky was that he delivers a novel to Stilovsky by November 1st of 1866. And remember, this is the year when he is serializing Crime and Punishment. And if he doesn't deliver this novel by November 1, Stilovsky will own the rights to all of Dostoevsky's publications for the next 9 years. Why so many years? Stilovsky felt that Dostoevsky was a prisoner of the state for 9 years, and now his mind is going to be the prisoner of Stilovsky for 9 more years. The man had an ego. It's October 1 of 1866, and not a single line of the novel has been written. And here on display, I have the memoir of Anna Grigorievna Dostoevskaya, who was at that point Anna Grigorievna, and here's her portrait, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, who was the 18-year-old stenographer who was hired to take dictation so that Dostoevsky could live up to his obligation to Stilovsky. And the novel that he dictated to Anna Grigorievna was The Gambler. There's a wonderful Russian film. It was made in 1981 called 26 Days from the Life of Dostoevsky, that describes this experience, that depicts the experience of Dostoevsky dictating The Gambler to Anna Grigorievna. And they finish. In 26 days, Dostoevsky creates the novel The Gambler. He rushes the manuscript to the house of the publisher, Stilovsky. And of course, his servant says that he has not seen Stilovsky all day. Stilovsky is not a fool. He does not want to lose this contract. Dostoevsky is not a fool either. He goes to a police station and gets a dated, timed receipt from the head of police. It's a document that cannot be argued in court. Dostoevsky wins. Anna Grigorievna Snitkina comes back to his apartment in a few days to collect the pay for this project. He expresses his gratitude to her. And here is her diary that is opened on October 4 of 1866, where she describes the entire experience of her meeting her husband, and then describes their 16-year life together. And Dostoevsky expresses his gratitude for her involvement in this project. He tells her that he couldn't have done it without her. And he tells her of a novel that he is writing. The novel is about an older artist. He's unwell. He's not successful. And he falls in love with a younger woman. And he asks Anna Grigorievna Snitkina if she feels such a novel development would be possible. And here I have several quotes from her diary. And her answer at this point was, looking for it, I would answer that I love you and will love you all my life. And let me read to you Anna Grigorievna's recollection of that happy moment in her life. I won't try to convey in words I won't try to convey the words full of tenderness and love that he said to me then. They are sacred to me. I was stunned, almost crushed by the immensity of my happiness, and for a long time I couldn't believe in it. I remember that when Fyodor Mikhailovich, almost an hour later, began to talk of plans for the future and asked my opinion, I told him, how can I make any decision about anything now? I'm too horribly happy. So that is the beginning of Dostoevsky's new life, a new era in his life. And all this comes from the publication of The Gambler, which was dictated to Anna Grigorievna Snitkina. Here on display, we have the cover of the record of Sergei Prokofiev's The Gambler. And I mentioned to you that Janacek and Prokofiev are the only two composers who wrote substantial works based on both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. So if Janacek wrote the opera based on Dostoevsky's Notes from the Dead House and the string quartet based on Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata, the young Sergei Prokofiev wrote an opera adaptation of The Gambler. And here is an image from the Mariinsky Theater performance of that opera. And of course, those of you who read War and Peace with me, we are the lucky recipients of an entire opera based on Tolstoy's War and Peace, and it was also written by Sergei Prokofiev. The Gambler happens to be his first opera. He was a very young man when he wrote it, and it didn't receive a performance in the Bolshoi Theater till 2001. So it's one of those unknown masterpieces that took a long time to bring to the Bolshoi stage. And so from here on out, we are entering the final section of the exhibition, and the section of the exhibition entitled The Prophet. Why The Prophet? Because many literary critics consider the final 5 Dostoevsky novels, and those are Crime and Punishment, Idiot, Demons, The Adolescent, and Brothers Karamazov, prophetic. What is so amazing about this final section of the exhibition is that we have these 5 novels in the illustrations of Fritz Eichenberg, and I've been posting these illustrations for Brothers Karamazov quite often on the 100 Days of Brothers Karamazov tutorial page. So here are his illustrations for Crime and Punishment, his illustration for the novel The Idiot, one of the illustrations for his novel Demons, and I mentioned this novel quite often during the Brothers Karamazov tutorial. His illustration for the novel The Adolescent, and some of the illustrations that I posted for Brothers Karamazov. This is his illustration of the Grand Inquisitor chapter, and the illustration of that moment when Alyosha regains faith and becomes a fighter. In this case, I also have a number of personal items, such as icons that belong to my grandmother, who was Russian. Her name was Lyudmila Mikhailovna. And a second icon of St. George, and of course in Russian he's called Georgy, Georgy Pobedonosets. And last and not least, an icon of St. Nicholas, and it just happens to be St. Nicholas Day today. So there's my icon of St. Nicholas, who is the patron saint of Russia. Crime and Punishment was published and serialized in the Russian Messenger, and it became a hugely successful Dostoevsky novel. It's remarkable to what extent Crime and Punishment is an extension of everything that Dostoevsky has done in Notes from Underground. And in so many ways, the underground man evolves into Raskolnikov, and the prostitute Lisa from Notes from Underground evolves into Sonia Marmeladova. Students often ask me, where do I begin my study of Dostoevsky? And I often suggest to students reading Notes from Underground first, and then following up with Crime and Punishment. Here on display, we also have an image of the Haymarket Square, which was the location around which most of the events of Crime and Punishment take place. And if you travel to St. Petersburg today, I can't recommend enough doing the Crime and Punishment tour around the Haymarket Square and surrounding area, because you are able to see the house that is the house where Raskolnikov lived, the house of Sonia Marmeladova, and you can also see the house where Dostoevsky lived while he was writing Crime and Punishment in this neighborhood. The Idiot, the second of the great prophetic works, was not written in St. Petersburg. This novel was written in Geneva and in Florence during the early years of Dostoevsky's marriage. He was so in debt that it was possible that he would have been thrown into a debtor's prison. And so he and Anna Grigorievna Snitkina spent the first years of their marriage abroad. Their first child, a daughter, was born in Geneva and sadly died when she was just a few months old. So these first years of marriage that Dostoevsky longed for so much, this settled, happy life, were marred by a great deal of tragedy and hardships. Dostoevsky's gambling continued for another 5 years. He doesn't stop gambling till about 1871, early 70s. And here on display, you have also the reproduction of the image of Holbein's Christ. It's Hans Holbein the Younger's body of the dead Christ in the tomb, painted in the 16th century. Dostoevsky saw this painting in Basel in Switzerland. And Anna Grigorievna Dostoevskaya now wrote in her diaries about the tremendous impact this painting had on Dostoevsky. This painting becomes the focal point of his novel, The Idiot. And what I love about the Fritz Eichenberg illustration to The Idiot, take a look at this illustration. In it, you see two of the characters, Myshkin and Rogozhin, exchanging crosses. But do you see what image is right in the background above their heads? It's the image of the Holbein Christ. So that's why I love the Fritz Eichenberg illustration so much. He is fully aware of all of the important aspects of these novels, and he brings so much of Dostoevsky's ideas into his illustrations. So The Idiot is written abroad, and part of Demons is written abroad as well. Demons is the most political of Dostoevsky's novels. He creates a novel where characters cook up a revolution. And one of his characters, Pyotr Verkhovensky, is actually based on the revolutionary Sergei Nechayev, who wrote The Catechism of a Revolutionary, which was published in 1869. And it became to a how-to manual for radical groups committed to the overthrowing of the existing social and political order by all means possible, including violence and terror. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky starts developing his thinking about the catastrophic impact that ideas can have on people. In Demons, one of the characters, this Pyotr Verkhovensky, who is based on the revolutionary Sergei Nechayev, says to one of the characters, and he really sums up the core of these ideological obsessions. It was not you who ate the idea, but the idea ate you. And Dostoevsky explores this group of highly ideological human beings who are consumed by ideas to the detriment of their humanity, to the detriment of lives and happiness of so many inhabitants of this provincial town where the novel takes place. And also the novel's title, Demons, is the epigraph to the novel is a reference to the New Testament story of the exorcism of the demoniac and gives a clue to the novel's title. The saved demoniac sits at the feet of Christ, cured of the demons or destructive ideas that possessed him, which now infest the swine rushing off the cliff to their death. That is Dostoevsky's vision for Russia. And it's remarkable to what extent this vision becomes prophetic in the 20th century. The Adolescent is quite possibly the least read novel of Dostoevsky. And when I said this to my students this fall, one of them brought a copy of Adolescent to class the next day or the next time we met and said, Anna, it's not going to be unread by me. And so he's reading Dostoevsky and Dostoevsky's Adolescent and absolutely loving it. In Dostoevsky's, in this novel, The Adolescent, Dostoevsky really explores some of the ideas that he already proposed in Crime and Punishment, Idiot, or Demons. He is grappling with this idea, and it's Dostoevsky's meditation on the explosive and unresolvable conflict between the Russian liberals of the 1840s, the fathers, and the radicalized and iconoclastic youth of the 1860s and 70s, the sons. And he continues this exploration in the novel. This is yet another callback to the writer Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons that influenced Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And of course, last but not least, Brothers Karamazov. I really could spend hours talking about this novel. One of the items on display here is a photograph I took in the Dostoevsky Museum in St. Petersburg of his study and the desk where Brothers Karamazov was finished. And also one of the churches at Optina Monastery where Dostoevsky went after the death of his 3-year-old son, Alyosha, who died of epilepsy, a disease he inherited from Dostoevsky. So Dostoevsky was so devastated by this death that he ended up taking a pilgrimage to the Optina Monastery to seek wisdom from the Holy Fathers there. And these experiences, as well as life stories he saw unfold as a convict in Siberia, laid the foundation for Brothers Karamazov. And let me just read to you my notes in this case. In 1880, Dostoevsky was invited to speak at the unveiling of the Pushkin Monument in Moscow. This appearance resulted in a universally acclaimed speech that celebrated not only the great Russian poet Pushkin, but the tenacity and strength of the Russian spirit. Dostoevsky the convict had become Dostoevsky the prophet. He was hailed as the conscience of the nation. And so what a journey from his first publications to his years in Siberia, to the turbulent years of gambling and trying to find his voice and trying to find success, to meeting Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, who became his muse, his lover, his wife, the mistress of his home, but also his publisher. Remarkably, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina publishes Dostoevsky's works after they are serialized, and the last 5 novels were all serialized. The Adolescent was the only one that was not serialized in the Russian Messenger. It was published in the Notes of the Fatherland. And Anna Grigorievna Snitkina becomes hugely influential in Dostoevsky's life because she creates the stability that he lacked all through his life in order for him to focus on his writing. In addition to that, starting with, of course, The Gambler, but then The Idiot, Demons, Adolescent, and Brothers Karamazov were all written the same way as The Gambler. Dostoevsky dictated them to Anna Grigorievna Snitkina. He would sequester himself in his study with his wife in the afternoons and act out the novels in front of her. She would take them out in stenographic form, then turn her stenographic notation of what Dostoevsky dictated to her into Russian. That would become the first draft of the novel. Then Dostoevsky would work with that first draft and make all of the editing based on that and create an outline for the next day's dictation. So that's how The Idiot, Demons, The Adolescent, and Brothers Karamazov were all written. And of course, I have an entire section dedicated to the Grand Inquisitor, which is one chapter in Brothers Karamazov and the most consequential chapter of all of Dostoevsky's writing. I'm just going to read the last section of this panel. According to the literary critic George Steiner, Dostoevsky remains the eternal disturber and dissembler of freedom and tragedy, the man to whom the resurrection of an individual soul was more important than the material progress of an entire society. And here we have the final image of Dostoevsky. This is one of the last photographs taken of him. He died of pulmonary hemorrhage on February 8, 1881, in his St. Petersburg apartment. His confession and communion took place before his parting from Anna and their 2 surviving children. He bequeathed his New Testament to his son, whose name was also Fyodor. The final lines he read from the New Testament were from Matthew 3, 14, 15. Those of you who are reading Brothers Karamazov with me, the epigraph of Brothers Karamazov, and I'm going to read it to you right now. is verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground, and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. John 12:24. This inscription is on his tomb at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery in St. Petersburg. I also have a note here about his funeral and his burial ground. Dostoevsky is buried on the grounds of the Alexander Nevsky Monastery in St. Petersburg, Russia. The Tikhvin Cemetery is part of the vast monastery complex and the final resting place of numerous writers, composers, including Nikolai Karamzin, Vasily Zhukovsky, Mikhail Glinka, Modest Mussorgsky, Alexander Borodin, and Peter Tchaikovsky. So Dostoevsky is in fabulous company. He is literally seconds of walking from the graves of Glinka, Mussorgsky, Borodin, and Tchaikovsky. And the funeral procession of Fyodor Dostoevsky, and here's an image of the funeral procession. The entire city of St. Petersburg, which he immortalized on the pages of his novels, became paralyzed on the day of his funeral. And when they mourned the passing of the Russian prophet, tens of thousands of people came to pay their final respects. The funeral procession stretched the length of the entire Nevsky Prospect, St. Petersburg's main avenue. It lasted for 3 hours. This portrait of Dostoevsky, which we are using as the main image for both the exhibition and for 100 Days of Brothers Karamazov, this portrait was painted on the request of the founder of the Tretyakov Gallery, and it is housed in the Tretyakov Gallery. And some of the final moments of our tour, we can look at the final display case here. Some of the authors who were inspired by Dostoevsky, such as Franz Kafka, George Orwell, and Huxley, whose Brave New World Revisited actually quotes from Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor chapter. And of course, the illustrator Fritz Eichenberg, who so lovingly portrayed the characters and concepts of the final 5 Dostoevsky novels. And we have all of those on display here at the University of Iowa Main Library Gallery. And all of these illustrated copies of Dostoevsky's novels belong to the University of Iowa Special Collections. And then in the middle of the room, we have a few books which are suggested reading for the future. We have the 5-volume Joseph Frank biography, who spent his entire life writing the biography of Dostoevsky. So here are the 5 volumes. Or if you don't have time to read a 5-volume biography of Dostoevsky, here is the shorter 1-volume version. The Konstantin Machulsky biography of Dostoevsky is probably the best biography written in Russian. And then this is the book that I consider to be my favorite book of criticism. It's George Steiner's Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. And I jokingly say that everything I know about these 2 writers, I learned from George Steiner. Movable Feast of Hemingway's here. He talks a great deal about his love for Russian writers, including Turgenev, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky in this book, and also in his Green Hills of Africa. What else do we have here? Travels in Siberia by Anne Fraser. We have Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, Oram Pamuk's The Black Book, and also American Psycho, that is hugely influenced by Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, or Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which was also influenced by Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. At this point, I'm just going to show the entire exhibition and come a little closer to Dostoevsky himself and say a huge thank you to Dostoevsky for everything that he has bequeathed to us. We are so lucky to be on the receiving end of this incredible heritage that we inherited from him. And I would like to thank you for attending this virtual tour. So at this point, this tour will be cut off, this will be the edited version. And I'm going to have a seat and switch the camera. Here I am. So if anybody wants to ask me a few questions, let me see the time. Yeah, we went way over time. So I've been drinking a ton of tea with honey to save my voice for this, and I think my voice made it, but I don't have too much voice left, so I could answer a couple of questions, and then I'm just going to shut this down. Any questions? And just speak up, because I see only four of you per screen. So just go ahead and ask.
Hi, Anna, it's Doug Wolf. And again, thank you so much for meeting with me when I came through last month and visited and made time for me. I really appreciate that. It just so impresses me with Dostoevsky, and to use your phrase, everything's connected. You know, how all the way through his life and all the pieces, how everything is interrelated and builds upon itself and refers back. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, you know, I teach his big five, with the exception of the adolescent, every year. And I start with notes from underground. And then in one class, we do Crime and Punishment and Demons. In another class, we do The Idiot and Brothers Karamazov. And students often take independent studies with me and read everything else, because they feel that if they read everything else, they will understand the building blocks of the Great Five so much more. And so you can start with Poor Folk, and you already will see the complexity of the psychological connections between human beings that you will see in Brothers Karamazov, but it's already there when he's 23 years old. It's just absolutely remarkable how, for a human being whose life was interrupted by so much tragedy, the consistency of his intellectual growth can be followed from his 20s into his late 50s. And the line is unbroken. If anything, all of the tragedies he encountered in his life enhance the incredible complexity of his thinking. Yeah, stunning. One more question, and then I'm going back to having more tea with honey.
I'm curious about how he broke his gambling addiction. Is there any information about that? How
Yeah,
he did
writes
it?
about it. He writes it in his writer's diary. He goes for a walk, and all of a sudden it just hits him. It's just one moment he was a gambler. He actually gambled away his wife's wedding ring at one point. One point he is a gambler, and then he comes back from that walk, and that's it. It's like Alyosha falling to the ground, a youth, and standing up and being this this fighter. That happened to Dostoevsky so many times. It's like Mita hitting the wall at full speed and all of a sudden realizing that something had to stop him because he didn't have the will to stop himself. That's exactly what happened with Dostoevsky and his imprisonment in Siberia. He really felt that he was just not a good human being in his 20s. And the only thing that stopped him was Siberia. And so Alyosha falling to the ground and becoming a fighter, it's like Dostoevsky all of a sudden walking away and not gambling anymore. Oh, and look who's here. Wave to Sarah, come here. So Sarah is the gallery coordinator, and we joke that the two of us actually just sleep here in the gallery and guard it.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm almost done.
Okay.
Okay, yes. So we are going to try to schedule it will be probably a combined volume 3 and 4 for some time in January. So by then you'll be done rereading the novel because you will have, your life will turn upside down when you finish this novel, to the point where you will feel like you need to read it again in order to understand what Dostoevsky is attempting to accomplish here a little bit more fully. So sometime in January, we'll do the volume 3 and 4. And I am halfway through Balzac's The Black Sheep. I'm just doing everything possible to save my voice. So I talk as little as possible and read as much as possible. And I'm definitely enjoying my completely immoral French obsession. There's no morality in French novels, and there are no souls. There are tons of disreputable lawyers. So it's a nice antidote to I think I've written something for 250 days this year. So I've written every single day for 250 days this year. And it's all about lots and lots of soul. And at this point, I'm abandoning soul for 1 year. And then when we come back to Anna Karenina in 23, I'll be ready for more soul. Okay, so we'll have our meeting sometime in January. And I'm looking forward to that. 3 more days. Bye-bye. So good to talk to you. Bye-bye.